Welcome along to Obsession Engineering, and another of my bikes is on the bench because my BMW is going back to TT this year, which means it needs a fresh engine in it. And I already have a fresh engine. So what we're doing to do today is take that one out, put the fresh one in. So I think it's time to get on the spanners. So first job, as always, is to get the bodywork off the bike. Helped a little bit today by the fact the belly pan's already off, and by the fact that all of the fairing on this is held on with Zeus fasteners, so it's nice and easy to get off. I do tape the fasteners on it because I go road racing and stuff vibrates loose. That's one fairing off, which means we can get to the important bits. And obviously it is still winter here in England, which means I'm wearing my Obsession Engineering woolly hat, now available in a couple of different colours. So if you like the channel, why not get yourself an awesome bobble hat? And there's also sweatshirts and hoodies and t-shirts and other wonderful things. So get yourself onto obsessionengineering.co.uk and get your head lovely and warm. Technically, this bike is actually out of homologation. It is too old for TT. This is a 2017 BMW, like the second batch of Gen 3s with some minor updates for the Euro emissions. But it should have been out of date at the end of 2024. But Tom Whedon rode it last year and he loved the bike to bits, so he's applied for dispensation with the TT organisers, who very sensibly allowed him to run the bike again. But the engine that's in the bike now has done quite a bit of mileage and will be coming out and will at some point get a refresh. But I already have a refreshed engine, so that can go in the bike, and once the engine's in, it will have to go to the dyno, do some running in miles, and then it can get used a little bit of short circuits and stuff to make sure everything's really good with it before we send it down Bray Hill. After my 2008 ZX10, which was on the channel recently, getting a little bit of TLC, after the ZX10 I had an RSV4, which I rode for 3 years at TT, and then I got a little bit fed up constantly being overtaken by BMWs in a straight line. And so I went from having the most interesting bike on the grid to having the same thing that everybody else had. But when these things are wide open, they are so much fun that actually, yeah, the RSV4 made a bit more noise and maybe had a little bit more character to it. But a tool for a job, this is way better. More reliable, faster, easier to live with because everybody's got them, easier to set up because loads of people have got information. They are just a mega piece of kit, these Gen 3 BMWs. So this is actually my second Gen 3 BMW. My first one was a 2015 bike that I bought off Paul Shoesmith. It was one of Shoey's own bikes, and it was a year old when I bought it, and I rode it for a couple of years, and then I had the option to buy a fresh one. So I bought a new bike, a brand new one, and I sold my old one to Eric, who, first time out at Anglesey, actually beat me on it. But, well, we've had words about that kind of behaviour since then. And these Gen 3s are just mega bits of kit. The engines are really strong in them. The chassis works really well, especially as a road race bike. They're just mega. And so, I haven't changed it. So at the top end we've got throttle bodies under there, airbox, top injector rail, top fuel rail, ECU. But the first thing we're actually going to do is cut a load of cable ties off so we can get to all of the wiring and move it all out of the way a bit. With the cable ties undone, there is one screw that is easy to take out that holds the ECU in place. So that can come out and go in the box. And then we just simply pull the electrical connectors off the ECU. One of the brilliant things that BMW did with these Gen 3 bikes is they did maps for the standard ECU. And so instead of having to buy a separate instead of having to buy a separate race ECU, or like the RCK Pro and stuff that they're running now, you could go to your BMW dealer, you could unlock the standard ECU, put the HP power up map in it, and then you could buy the calibration kit and you could do all your mapping changes, all your traction settings, all your wheel size changes. Everything can be done in the standard ECU for a few £100. Compared to buying an aftermarket race ECU, that was just brilliant, and it made the bike so cost effective to build because you didn't have to spend a fortune on electronics to get stuff that worked really, really well. One thing that is worth paying attention to on the top of the airbox on these is that connector, which is a airbox pressure or temperature sensor, I can't remember which one. That is the same connector as all the injectors, and you can swap that one and that one around. And then when you try and rev your bike and it tries to use a secondary injector, you get a fault code up, and obviously your bike doesn't run properly. So the identifier is a little bit of white tape on that. That means it's the airbox sensor and not one of your chop injectors. And the first time, of course, I ever took the bike apart, I swapped the crimp connector on the fuel line for a proper, like, fuel line high pressure little Jubilee clip, and that just makes it a little bit quicker when you're taking the engine out. What you can do is just undo these bolts down here and take the whole fuel rail out, but then it sort of flaps around on the fuel pipe a bit. So I decided it was easier to have a little Jubilee clip on it. Another bit of very sensible German engineering is how you get to the air filter. So on the road bike, you don't have to take the fuel tank off to get to your air filter. You can just take the airbox cover off, the little piece of trim in front of the tank, and then take that clip out. And then literally the front panel slides out like that, followed by those two clips. And then like basically the airbox, the air filter holder comes out. And then behind that on my bike is an MWR, like World Superbike spec air filter. That can come out. That will get a thorough wash and a re-oil before it goes back in. And the next thing to do is take the airbox off. And that's also pretty easy. So before we lift the airbox off, we need to take that off. I've already taken the 3 screws out, and that is the motor that drives the variable throttle. Lift it up, disconnect the electrical connector off the bottom, put the O-ring somewhere safe, and that's another bit out of the way. There is a breather pipe that goes up at the back of there, so I've just pulled that off the bottom of the airbox, and I've also taken out the 4 screws that go there, there, and the equivalent ones on the other side, and then the airbox will literally just wiggle off, and there we go, one airbox off. And if you want to see how the variable throttles work, the motor that connects up here basically just spins that. For top end running, you have short bell mouths for extra power. For lower RPM running when you want more torque, a longer inlet tract, like that. Simples. The next job on the list is to take the throttle bodies off. And so there is an electrical connector here for like the fly-by-wire motor. And then there's the 4 bottom injector connectors down here. And they've got little tabs to get your fingers in, so you can unclip those pretty easily. A couple of cable ties cut off. And there is a throttle position sensor that sits on this side of the throttle body, so I just need to trace it down here. It is this plug here, so I just need to unhook it from the frame and disconnect that. I almost forgot the fuel pressure sensor connector that goes in the bottom of here. So the next bit's pretty straightforward. We're just going to give them a pull. This bike, the like spring tension clips that hold the throttle bodies tight to the inlet ports, the inlet rubbers, they've got a bit of flex in them, so they'll actually come undone all right. The later bikes, the Gen 4s, if you try just pulling them off, they have a tendency to split the rubbers. And so you don't want to do this on a later bike. But on these, by far the easiest way to get those off is just give them a bit of a pull. Get a bit of rag down the inlet port so that nothing unpleasant can go in there. And then we can get to the connectors and disconnect the 4 coils. There is a cam sensor. There is a water temperature sensor there. There's a drive for the starter motor. There is also an earth tuck down there as well. The earth and the starter motor wire, I have known somebody connect them the wrong way up. The earth, the ground, whatever you want to call it, is brown. And the starter motor live is black. And then there's just to go around, check there's no other electrical connectors, gear position sensor, crank pickup, stuff like that. Make sure they're all undone. And that's the top end, nearly finished. I run the HM shifter because it's a little bit more positive on your gear change because it doesn't have the movement in it that the standard switch does. But instead of going up through the loom and disconnecting all of that, what I'm just going to do is undo that 10mm bolt, slide the spline off, and I'm just going to cable tie that out the way up here so that we're not disturbing it, we're not pulling on the wiring. I'm also going to knock the tab washer off the front sprocket, buzz the front sprocket off, and then I can just slide the chain and the sprocket together off there and out the way. The single most awkward electrical connector on the bike is this one. That is the feed from the generator on the end of the crankshaft to the reg rec, which is buried under there. And so obviously it's quite awkward to get to begin with. And these, they have a bit of a tendency to like capillary some oil from the crankcases into the actual connector. And then that gets hot because it's all bolted around the back of the engine, and the connectors actually stick quite well into the back of there. And so I sprayed a bit of penetrating fluid around it, and after several minutes of swearing, that did eventually come off. That has been an issue before, hence why some of the tabs broken. So to release the clutch cable, I've put all the slack I can in this end and a reasonable amount in the actual engine end, and then pop the clutch cable completely out of the lever. So you've got loads and loads of slack, and then you have enough slack at this end to just feed it out of there, out the actual connector onto the clutch body, and then pull the clutch cable out of the holder on the top of the engine, because the other engine already has a clutch cable holder on it, so we don't need that bit, we just need the cable. So I've done quite a lot of BMW engines, and I'm confident of where all the electrical connectors and clutch cable routing and stuff like that goes. If it's your first time doing an engine, it's always a good idea. Take photos of the routing for the electrical connectors, where each one goes if you want to, how the clutch cables and bits like that route. Take a load of photos on your phone, and then that last connector, when you're putting it back together that's making you scratch your head, you can just look back through the photos. Just realised a slight issue with an earlier plan. Was planning to leave the oil in it. Normally I take it out so the engine is lighter, and when you put engines in you would generally put fresh oil in them. But that's fairly fresh oil. But then I've realised it's much easier to get the exhaust pipes off with the oil cooler out the way. But the oil cooler pipes run lower than the level in the sump where the oil runs. So it would be much better if I took the oil cooler off. So in fact what I'm going to do is get a very clean receptacle. I'm going to drop the oil out of the bike into my clean receptacle, and then when I put the fresh engine in, I'm just going to put that oil in it to run it in. And that makes life a little bit easier with oil cooler and exhaust pipe combos. Now I have my oil draining out, I can start undoing my oil cooler pipes. And so there is a connector here on this side of the engine, and then there's one slightly awkwardly behind the exhaust header pipes on the other side of the engine, but it is accessible. It's just not perfectly accessible. Take the screw out, making sure we don't drop that. Leak some oil, even though I have an oil drain tray, I've still managed to miss it, and so I'll go around the other side and do the other pipe. And with the oil cooler pipes off, there's a screw either side that hold the oil cooler to the bottom of the radiator, which are nice and accessible. And then one of my favourite design bits on these BMWs is the radiator and the oil cooler are held on with E-clips, and so they just literally push on. You can pick them off with your finger, and then I can wiggle my oil cooler off its bracket, take it out of the bike. Might drain the excess oil out of that, and then we'll cover the ends up, put it out of the way. Next stop on the list is the radiator, but before I can undo the little clips here, there's two at the top, one at the bottom to undo. Before I can undo those and take the radiator off, there is some electrical connectors, because I still run the fan on this, and the wheel speed sensor for the front wheel also runs to it. So I just need to undo a couple of electrical connectors, and then that can come off, because the actual water pipes on both sides I've already undone. With the radiator removed, I've also taken out the little deflector that sits behind here. It's just held on with a couple of screws. I've left it in so that when it rains, and I do actually still ride this bike in the rain, you don't get all the dirt up on top of the engine, and it helps duct the heat sort of downwards away from the fuel tank and bits like that. So I've left it in, a lot of people don't. Not sure it really makes a lot of difference. Anyway, also taking off the bracket that holds the radiator, and the next thing to do is take off the springs for the exhaust. Now I will be swapping the collars over later, but to get the system off, it's a little bit easier to take the springs off. And so a proper spring puller. Don't try and do this with pliers because they will slip and things will go wrong and you will either punch the bench or hit yourself in the face with something. So a proper spring puller, much easier and much safer. So keeping the exhaust system complete as one big lump, it can be the quickest way of doing it, but sometimes when you need to wiggle the system around, you end up hitting the silencer into brackets and stuff. So I've already taken the bracket off that holds the silencer. I shall slide the silencer off and then it's a little bit easier to handle just wiggling the rest of the system around. And then hopefully with a bit of a wiggle, hopefully my header pipes will start to come out. They are always quite tight because you don't want your exhaust pipes leaking, so they want to be fairly snug. But yes, today they are especially snug, and so this might take me a minute. So after a reasonable amount of wiggling, I've got the exhaust headers off, well, the exhaust system off. I've also taken the collars off the front of the engine because I'll need them, and I've also whipped the exhaust gaskets out, which I will admit I normally reuse. I have then set up my homemade engine cradle. It is, as you can see, just some bits of wood that are nailed together, and I've put them on a scissor jack, so that's going to support the weight of the engine, because the next thing to do is actually take the engine out. So this is the golden opportunity, and really quite an important opportunity, to go around and make sure you've disconnected everything. Earth wires, starter motor feeds, they're the really common ones to leave connected, gear position sensors, crank pickups, all that sort of stuff. Make sure all your wiring is disconnected before you start taking engine bolts out. Because trust me, when the engine is halfway to the floor, that's a really awkward time to find you need to undo an electrical connector. So what we need to do next is go around and undo the engine mounting bolts. And there are 8 on these BMWs. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the equivalent on the other side. So this is the bolt arrangement on the right hand side of the frame. You have the engine bolt that goes in the engine bolt hole, but then you have basically a cone here and a spacer with a slot in it, so that when you tighten it up, the spacer pulls onto the cone and that expands and fills the gap in the frame. Because obviously if the frame was snug against the engine in all the positions, you wouldn't actually be able to get the engine in and out. And so there needs to be a bit of a gap and a bit of room so that you can get one set of bolts in, pull the engine onto one side of the frame where the datum is, because that's the chain run side, and then these ones basically secure everything on this side and take up the slack. So what I'm going to do is take all of the bolts out of the engine on this side, then all the bolts out of the engine on the other side, and hopefully it'll be pretty much balanced on my cradle. So my tool for screwing my jack up and down was on the far side of the bike, and I want to work on this side of the bike last. So I've swapped the jack around. Got the bolts out the other side, which means now we can go through the ones on this side, buzz these ones out, and hopefully the engine will stay put. As I unscrew the last bolt, this is a good test. It's not got a lot of load on the bolt as I screw it out, which is good, which means the engine is not trying to either drop on the floor or disappear out the top of the bike, so I've got the balance about right on it. If you don't have a jack and a little stand, a friend, or probably a couple of friends, would be very, very useful at this stage, because engines are heavy. I haven't got that many mates, and I certainly haven't got one here today because Rob is actually off taking the engine out of another TT bike. I am flying solo a little bit today, but that's all right. Got you for company, haven't I? It's good job you're not chatty though. As you go down, you also have to go down and then a bit forward, because the gear position sensor and actually the frame to an extent sort of sit in above the swinging arm a little bit. And so we're now at the point where we can just gently lower down. And another advantage of using the jack is you can go millimetre by millimetre, as opposed to having your mates holding it when you decide you need to change something and they've got the load. So a jack is definitely a good idea. Right, and that is the load off the jack and an engine dangling there. So what I need to do next is lift the engine up, slide the jack out from underneath it. A little bit awkward on your own, but there you go. And then I need to lug that onto the floor or onto the bench, which I don't recommend doing on your own because they're quite heavy. So go and talk amongst yourselves while I do something I wouldn't recommend. With the bench clear and a big hole in the middle of what used to be my BMW, it's an excellent time to get into the swinging arm and around the bottom of the frame and inside the frame rails and stuff, give everything a decent wipe clean because you've got the golden opportunity. And then we can do the reverse thing and lump the new engine over here. To get the next engine on the jack, I did actually have to go and find a friend. Didn't take me too long, so that's a good thing, and because just obviously lifting it onto the bench when getting the jack and bits underneath it is decidedly awkward. But now we have an engine, wobbly, and we have a jack and bits, so what I can do now is lift the engine up, shuffle it backwards into the right place in the frame, get my bolts in, without really having to hold on very much. So now I have my preferred bolt hole lined up, the sort of second one back from the front. I can just get my first bolt started and I can screw that in gently by hand. Then I'll nip round the other side and get the same one on the other side started. And then what I can do is, if I need to, I can like pivot the engine on those bolts a little bit, and that makes life a little bit easier for getting the rest of the bolts in. And again, you can tell when you've got it about lined up because the bolts basically screw in by hand. Not a lot of drag, so I must have the thread pretty much lined up with the hole. So after, admittedly, quite a lot of wiggling around and a little shuffle with the jack backwards so I could rotate the engine a little bit easier, I've got all my engine mounting bolts in. So that means I now need to go around and torque them all up. You basically give them all a bit of a nip and then go around and tighten them all to 60 Newton meters. And I like to start from the back and work my way forwards. Clickety click means we're in the right tightness. So now I have everything torqued up. It's basically a case of reattach everything that we detached on the previous one, and there isn't really necessarily an order, so I've decided to do the clutch cable first. So I've fed it through the side of the frame where it needs to run. I've hooked it onto the actuator arm at that end, and then I'm going to feed it into the clutch lever. And I like to set the clutch lever with its adjuster about halfway along its adjustment, so you've got a bit to go at either way. And then basically I'll take the slack up with the adjuster that's on top of the engine. Just means you've got plenty of adjustment at your lever. With these bikes I run really quite a small amount of free play in the clutch lever. The reason being they've got a 2-position clutch switch, so it wants to see the clutch fully open or fully closed. So if the clutch opens to there, just a tiny little bit, it opens one of the clutch switches, and that means it thinks you've pulled the clutch in and your quick shifter, your blipper, traction and all that stuff stops working. So if you're riding it with a load of slack in it, if the wind catches it down the big straights at TT or something like that, it can just open the clutch enough that it turns half your electronics off. And we don't want that, so not too much play in your lever. Next easy job is hooking the front sprocket back on with the chain already on it. And what I've actually done is loosen the rear wheel nut and just slid the spindle through just a little bit so it comes off the adjuster. So I've got loads of chain slack. Right, slide that on. So having put a bit of copper slip on the thread for me sprocket nut, I'm putting the sprocket nut on without the tab washer first, and I'm just going to give it a very slight nip up, and that's going to push the sprocket all the way on and leave a little bit of the spline exposed so I can actually get the tab washer on. Otherwise there is a bit of a tendency for the tab washer not to actually sit correctly against there, and then it doesn't do it properly, and then everything can move, and then your chain falls off, and then you have a bad day. So I've always found the easiest way to do over a tab washer is to get your pipe grips on it and just pull it over like that. I'm only doing it in one place, that's not going to come undone, and now I can slide my chain adjuster back into place, get that on, and put my selector back on next as well. Oh, and nearly forgot, put my case saver back on as well, so that if a chain does ever fail, it won't just wipe out the crankcases. So that is the sprocket area stuff done. I've put some little dabs of torque check on them. The ones on the gear position sensor to prove that they've actually got Loctite on them. The one on the gear selectors just to be absolutely sure that I've done it up. I've reset the chain tension. I've got that all happy days. So that is that area of the bike done. I've already put the exhaust header stubs on. Copper slip on the threads, gaskets in. That is ready to receive its collector. So I best get an exhaust pipe and have a bit of a shuffle round. I have put some GT85, so just a little bit of lubricant on the actual stubs where they slide into the collars in the head. As I pull the exhaust springs on using my puller, hot exhaust gases flow faster, which means you can get rid of your exhaust quicker, which generally means you can then fill your cylinder more efficiently, which means you make more power. And stainless, like steel headers, stay hotter longer than titanium. Titanium is very good at giving away heat, and so a steel exhaust system will generally make a tiny bit more horsepower. And we are talking tiny bit, but it's cheaper, it's sturdier, and it can make more horsepower. Why would you not want it? Well, it's not as bling, and it weighs a little bit more. So exhaust headers are on, in fact complete exhaust system is on, and I've put the oil cooler back on. In a little ducting panel refitted, radiator refitted. Before I did then, I connected the cam sensor because it's on the front of the engine. It's much easier before you put all this stuff in. Now I particularly like the way they attach radiators on these. You've got the little E-clips and you just literally push them on, push a washer on, slide the clip in. Realistically, it's not actually really any quicker than just putting a bolt in, but I like the simplistic idea of it. So you slide them in, all the radiator clamps are done with these constant pressure clips, so they can't work loose like a Jubilee clip, like a screwed clip, so that's all good. Reconnected the fan connection, the front wheel speed connection, took that onto the radiator as it was before, and that means, with also the bolts in there and a few other bits done up, that we can move on to connecting everything inside the top of the engine. So I've already got starter motor connection, main earth next to the starter motor connected. Then there is another earth on the cylinder head. I've got the spark plug coils in, cam sensors in, and then there is also connectors for water temperature. There's 2 knock sensors. So the knock sensors that sit basically down on those bits, they monitor if there's any detonation in the cylinders, any knocking through the cylinders, and then especially on the road bike, they can basically lean the mixture off or add ignition to the bike to really clean the emissions up and clean the combustion up, and when it starts detonating then they can take some ignition back out of it, put a bit of fuel back in it, whatever. So you can get the bike to run more efficiently and cleaner with knock sensors. They are still, as far as I know, the only bike manufacturer that run them, especially on sort of sports bikes. Right, next thing to do really is get the throttle bodies on, because when they're on, I can connect the throttle body up, that and the throttle position sensor, and once that's on, of course I can get the airbox on and start connecting injectors up. I shall take the bits of rag out and just have a bit of a look down the inlets and make sure there is nothing down there, no debris, no bits of nuts, no fluff or anything down there, so we're happy with that. When I first worked on BMWs we realised how well the Germans finished the inlet ports, so they are still a cast finish, which arguably can be better than a really smooth polished finish, because if it's smooth you can get what they call wall wetting, which is where the fuel vapour basically in the fuel sticks to the actual cylinder walls. If they're ever so slightly rough, like a sandblasted or a cast finish, you get a tiny bit of turbulence off the cylinder wall and it actually helps your gas flow. And so the finish is really good, but also down by the seats is just finished better than the Japanese tended to do, which of course all helps in making more horsepower. Give it a quick squirt with some GT85 or other similar lubricant to help everything just slip together nice and easily, and then slide the throttle body into about the right place, and with a bit of a shove it generally just slots into the inlet rubbers. It's relatively cold in here, so they might need a little assistance, but there is a trick for that. So sometimes when you're fitting the throttle bodies they can be quite tight in the rubbers, so you can generally like wiggle one end in to begin with, just get them moving, and then you can hold that end in, and sometimes if necessary just other end, just give them a bit of a tap. Because it was cold today, these ones took a reasonably good tap in and the camera moved halfway through, which is why you're not seeing that. But now they're in and they're tight, we can go around and just connect the last few bits up. So, throttle body connector, there is a throttle position sensor cable that comes out here. Bottom injectors, breather pipe or route up there, that plugs into the fuel rail. So I do have a spare connector down here, and that originally would have gone to the solenoid for some of the emissions like canister stuff. So that one's not used, but the wiring colour on it is different to the rest of the injectors, which is basically the only way I know it's different. So that will just get tucked down there, and then we'll cable tie the mesh to the bottom fuel connector rails up to the actual fuel rail out the way nice and tidy, and then put the airbox on. So the airbox fixes down with 4 screws, one in each corner. But when you push it down onto the throttle bodies, the actual inlet rubbers down here, they have a bit of a tendency to catch on the throttle body and not sort of sit correctly between the airbox and the throttle body. And so it's really useful to get your hand inside and actually run your fingers around inside the rim of the throttle body where the bell mouth goes in, and make sure that these are actually seated all the way in and all the way down, because sometimes they sort of get pushed out and lip into the airbox itself. So a little bit fiddly to show on camera, but what you're trying to do is get these bits to sit correctly so they don't pop out of the airbox here and sort of sit proud and let air in. With the airbox bolted down, I've made sure that the crankcase breather is connected in the bottom, the wiring loom tucks in on both sides, and then what we need to do next is connect the variable throttles up. So to do that, we will actually have to get a hand in the front of the airbox, twist that round to the open position for the throttles, and then we can drop the actual actuator in, connect the wire up to it, and screw that down. So airbox refitted, MWR air filter oiled, and that's back in. All the front of the airbox is on, ECU's on, everything's cable tied in position. Top injectors are on, fuel rails done up, the temperature or air pressure sensor, whichever one it is, in the top of the airbox with the little white mark on it, that's back on. And so top of the engine is done. I've got no spare electrical connector, so that is always good, which means we can put oil and water in it. So I filled the bike up with Motul 300V oil, and to make life a little bit easier for bleeding the coolant system up, I've put the bike on a side stand. So we have filled it mostly with antifreeze, but then down by the water pump, I just need to crack open this bleed point, because obviously you could get an airlock in the water pump. It's not a lot of air, but it is worth getting it out. And then obviously with the bike on the side stand, the air has a better route back up to the filler neck. And now that I have oil and antifreeze in the bike, we're going to spin it over on the starter motor. I can spin it over on the starter and keep an eye on the sight glass and make sure my oil level drops a bit. Considering this hasn't got a fuel tank on it, that was literally just running on the fuel that was in the fuel rail. I'd say that's pretty good. My oil level disappeared down straight away. It's just had a few revolutions to get the oil around it. Right, we'll top up some fluids, then we'll put a tank on and actually have a proper go. And with my fuel tank reconnected, I would normally say this is the moment of truth, but it's already started once with basically no fuel in it. So I'm pretty confident it's going to go. Ta-da! Right, now I'm going to give it a short run, recheck its fluid levels, then give it a full run up to temperatures, although the fan's on and off a couple of times, make sure it's been really, really hot, and then it's ready for running in. So I've run the BMW up to temperature, so the fan has kicked in and out a couple of times. It sounds perfect, there's no warning lights, few little revs, she's absolutely sweet as a nut. So the next thing for that is to go to the dyno and do some running in miles. But that is it for how to change an engine on a BMW. I hope this has been informative, and I'm going home to have some lovely spaghetti and meatballs, because there's very few things in life I like as much as meaty balls. And on that note, I really think it is time to go. So thanks for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.